Hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Andy, and if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis, and this is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Today's episode is sponsored by myself. More specifically, I have a book about Bitcoin called Hyper-Bitcoinization, a story about a revolution. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link down below in the description. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon and it should be the first result. It's not selling out if it's my own product. Last week, we talked about positive feedback loops and how Bitcoin leverages that concept to eat away at the value of other assets and become a superior store of value. This week, we'll focus on economic theory again and talk about inflation versus deflation. So if you're like me who has received some sort of post-secondary education on topics related to economics, you've probably been taught that a small amount of inflation is good. However, today we're going to challenge that idea and pose the question, do we really need inflation in order to grow an economy? And is deflation really the big bad wolf that we've all been taught to hate? So let me lay out the basic argument in favor of inflation first. By the way, this is called steel manning. Steel manning is the opposite of a straw man argument. A steel man argument is when you present an argument from your opponent's perspective in the strongest way possible before you present your opposing thoughts. So let me steel man the idea of a small amount of inflation is good. So the idea goes that a small amount of inflation provides pressure for people to spend their money, since people would realize that their money would lose value if they hold on to it for too long. Since one person's spending is another person's income, this increases the frequency that the money changes hands and therefore provides momentum in the economy. Further, we want to avoid deflation, since if the money that people have, if they gain value over time, then they would be incentivized to hold on to the money instead of spending it. Since one person's income is another person's spending, this could cause everyone's income to go down, and this would cause a recession or even worse, a depression. So I hope I've not misrepresented the argument from the pro-inflation side, but let me now provide an alternative viewpoint. Regarding the idea of deflation causing recessions, I would say that it depends on the level of deflation we're talking about. Even pro-inflation people would argue that hyperinflation is bad, meaning that if your currency inflated by over, let's say, 100% a year, that would be incredibly devastating to an economy. Yet, when people give examples of how deflation causes issues, they often resort to extreme examples of hyperdeflation. For instance, they would say, what if you wanted to buy a car and the car was $30,000 last year, but now it's $10,000 and you're thinking to just hold on to the money because the price keeps falling? If deflation was actually that severe, then yes, maybe that would be an actual decision that you would make, i.e. waiting and holding on to your money for dear life. But I think if we were to be fair, I don't think it's appropriate to compare a 2% inflation to hyper-deflation, just like how I'm not going to compare 2% deflation, so negative 2% inflation, to hyperinflation. So to make everything clear and fair, let's compare the moderate amount of inflation to a moderate amount of deflation. So if you want to put a number on it, let's say 2% inflation versus 2% deflation. And we're talking annual rates, by the way. So under moderate deflation, though, what would the world look like? Would society just collapse and would the economy just stop working? Well, think about it this way. We as humans have basic needs that we need to fulfill. We need food, we need water, and above that, it'd be nice to have a shelter so that we're not exposed to the elements. We're always going to need to spend money on those things no matter what. Let's say if you have no more food at home, so you decide to go to the grocery store. If you know that deflation is 2%, how would that influence your decision to buy what you need? So let's say if a pack of ground beef was $10, With a 2% annual deflation rate, that same pack of ground beef will be a whopping 20 cents cheaper in a year from now. So in a year from now, you'll be paying $9.80 as opposed to $10 for the exact same product. Are you going to wait around for a year just to get that pack of ground beef just to save 20 cents? I would reckon not, right? In fact, we see bigger examples of deflation all the time already, and I'm talking about the technology product space. Technology is deflationary. In 2012, I remember walking through a Best Buy, and this is Canada, so you can convert to US dollars if you want, but in 2012, an average 4K TV I remember was about 3,000 Canadian dollars. So 10 years later, though, a 4K TV that's probably even thinner and better would be a tenth of that price. So every year, Apple comes out with a new line of iPhones, and the older iPhones drop in price dramatically when the new one comes out. So if you see the latest iPhone and you really want it, if you just waited a year, you can probably get that same iPhone for, I don't know, at least 15% cheaper, probably more. So in the end, we're actually not talking about a 2% deflation rate anymore. When it comes to technology, we're frequently talking about deflation at a rate of 15% per year or more. Yet, despite this massive deflation in this space, if you look at the sales of 4K TVs or iPhones, the demand isn't exactly low. In fact, the number of electronics that each person owns, or each household owns, has exploded exponentially in the past decade. So, are we all crazy? Do we not know that these things deflate? Do we not know that we can always just buy something better if we held our money for a longer period of time? The point I'm trying to make is that the vast majority of us don't wait and hold on to our money. And this actually makes sense. Because you can wait if you want, and perhaps some people do, but at some point you have to pull the trigger. If your old phone breaks, then you have to get a new one, even though that you know the same phone you're looking at will be cheaper in a year from now. If you're at the grocery store and you know you can save $1 on this loaf of bread if you just wait till next year, well, you're probably still going to buy that bread anyways because you need to eat. If you stop consuming resources and just held on to all your money because of deflation and the value that you stand to gain from it, then you're going to die from starvation. So this whole idea of people holding on to their money and not spending it because of deflation, it only makes sense on paper. But if you actually compare it to reality, it doesn't line up with reality at all. People all have a baseline of consumption, of needs that they need to meet. So it's a mental question and a mental equation that we're all doing. And that equation is whether the value of what you're thinking of buying with your money is greater than the value you'd get from deflation by holding on to your money. So as an example, if I buy the bread now, would I benefit more from having the bread versus not having this bread now and waiting a year so that I can save $1 a year from now? If you think about it this way, deflation is beneficial also from a moral standpoint since it reduces the amount of money we spend on useless things. In late February and early March of 2022, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sanctions were placed on the Russian economy, which led to a huge decline in the value of Russia's native currency, the ruble. A phenomenon that occurred in Russia was people flooding into Apple stores in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and buying out Apple products such as iPhones, MacBooks, until they all ran out of stock. Think about why this occurred. This happened because people believed that Apple products were going to hold up their value better than the ruble, so everyone tried to convert their rubles to Apple products, not because they needed the products, but just because they didn't want to hold rubles. We see less extreme versions of this happening all over the world in places like Canada and the United States as well. A less extreme version of this phenomenon is called consumerism. People would often buy something just for the sake of buying it because they don't want to hold on to the cash. The entire system of inflation has programmed our brains to spend our money on things that we don't really need for the sake of spending money. And when this happens, this leads to waste. People would buy something, decide they don't like it, and if it's not something that can be returned, well, into the trash it goes. This is the opposite mindset that is promoted by a deflationary system. With a deflationary system, people have to carefully evaluate whether they want something or not and only buy it if they really want or need it. since the consequence of buying something that they don't like would be that they lost out on the gains of holding on to their money through deflation and also ended up with something that they didn't like. This is a moral argument since wasting resources is inherently immoral. Since, according to the UN with data from 2017, around 700 million people, or just about 9% of the world's population, still lives in what's classified as abject poverty. Expanding on the evils of inflation, I think that unfortunately the education system here in Canada and the United States really don't do a good job of financially educating people from a young age, and most people aren't taught enough financial education to thrive in our modern world. Why is it that as a society we've accepted that the purchasing power of our money is going to go down 2% per year, or most often even more, and we're like, yeah, we're okay with that? If your employer said to you, every year you're going to take a 2% pay cut, how fast would you be quitting that job? I don't think that people would be accepting a 2% pay cut every year on their salary, but they would accept a 2% inflation. But if you think about it, what's the difference? There is no difference. Say if you lived in a world where your salary didn't change but inflation was 2% versus a world where you took a 2% pay cut every year but have inflation at 0%, what's the difference? In my lifetime so far, which has not been that long, I'm 27, but just within my lifetime, I've seen the movement of people trying to push for the minimum wage to be raised to $15 an hour in the United States. And now there are even some places that actually do pay $15 an hour, but now I'm hearing that people are saying it should be raised to $25 an hour. And I bet by the time it hits $25 an hour, there'll be more people pushing for it to be $40. But by that time, inflation would have taken another toll. So people really don't realize what's going on. People ask for the minimum wage to be bumped up, and then it does. And then everyone celebrates until one guy says, hold on, wait a minute, guys, why can't I still afford my cost of living? And then people go, oh yeah, you're right, time to ask for a higher minimum wage. And then rinse and repeat. The minimum wage worker always gets the short end of the stick. And don't misunderstand, I'm not trying to disparage minimum wage workers. I worked my fair share of minimum wage when I was young. I'm just frustrated that we keep falling for the same trick over and over again. We get paid, we pay our bills, we realize it's not enough, we ask for more, and by the time we get more, the central banks have already printed so much money that inflation has gone up, so we still can't pay our bills. You've ever seen that video of the guy pulling a goat who got stuck in a trench? So there's this video online of this goat that fell into a ditch, and the guy pulls him out, and the goat starts running, takes like 3 steps, and falls right back into the trench. So it's the same thing with inflation. If you analyze the problem deeply, the problem isn't that the minimum wage isn't high enough, the problem is inflation. Remember in episode 2 we talked about 1971 and getting off the gold standard? Well, before you got paid, and the money was tied to gold, meaning that the value is necessarily concentrated in that money because it's tied to gold, and because there's only so much gold out there, it's a limited resource. With fiat, when new money is created, the purchasing power of each dollar just goes down, and the number you're seeing on the paper is the same, but the purchasing power goes down. So say if you're making $50K a year, the number still says $50K, but it's able to buy you a lot less. This is the point I want to drive home. We all need to stop hyper-focusing on the number. The number of dollars itself doesn't matter. It doesn't tell you any information because it's an inflationary monetary system. Remember how back in the day, eggs were like 50 cents a dozen, a car was $1,000, and a house was $50,000? And if you didn't know anything about economics, it would be like, wow, everything must have been so cheap back then. I would have done so well back then because right now I'm making $100K a year. Well, no, it doesn't work like that because back then $1 was worth a lot more. So again, the number itself does not matter. Our economic problems cannot be solved with more money. It can only be solved with increasing the amount of things that money buys us. What matters at the end of the day is productivity. So think about it this way. If I wanted to create more jobs, I could start building a canal, give everybody a spoon, and tell them to dig. I would create a lot of jobs, but my productivity would suck. We actually don't want more jobs, and we don't want more money. We want more productivity, which is the result of people working jobs, and we want more things that the money buys us, like goods and services. An increase in the amount of money without a proportional increase in the amount of goods and services just means that the prices for those goods and services goes up. So, when we're thinking about the question of inflation versus deflation, I want us to not focus so much on the number that appears on your screen or on your paper bills, but the value of the money itself. If we never increase the money supply, does that mean that the economy would stop growing? No, it doesn't. If we never increase the money supply, people will still go out and buy things because you still need to eat. It's just that each individual unit of whatever money you're using would increase in purchasing power. In other words, the value of the economy is subdivided into, say, millions of pieces. And in the case of Bitcoin, the number is exactly 21 million. And if the economy grows more valuable, then each piece out of that 21 million becomes more valuable. There's no need to increase the money supply because that doesn't do anything except dilute the amount of wealth that your money represents. On that note, in my opinion, inflation is also largely to blame for the ever-increasing wealth gap that we see in society today. Throughout history, inflation has been used as a tool for the rich to get richer. We talked about this briefly in episode 2, by the way. This is because inflation also makes debt easier to pay back. The strategy is for the rich to borrow money using their assets as collateral. So think of an extremely low interest loan by putting up your house as collateral. So if you're rich, you borrow against your mansion and you use the money to buy another mansion or stocks or any other type of investment, and you wait for inflation to kick in, which increases the value of your assets and also makes the value of the dollar goes down, which means it's easier for you to pay back your loan. Think about which debt is harder to pay back. $10,000 worth of debt in 1950 or $10,000 worth of debt now? It's easier to pay back $10,000 worth of debt now, right? Provided that the interest rate is low, you want to drag on your debts for as long as you can because inflation now works in your favor if you have a low interest debt. And the rich is able to get low interest rate debt because they have better credit scores and higher quality assets. As in, if you put down a house as collateral, the bank might be willing to loan you money at, say, 2%. But if you don't own a house and you try to put up your old beat up car as collateral, first of all, you won't be able to loan nearly as much money. And the bank will likely charge you a higher interest rate because your collateral just isn't as good. And your credit score probably isn't as good either. So summarizing, the strategy if you're rich is use your high quality assets to borrow against, invest the borrowed money into more assets, wait for the inflation to inflate away the value of your debts, and rinse and repeat. You can do this over and over again. If you're poor, you're not able to do this because you don't have any assets to borrow against in the first place, and inflation works against you because you're holding on to mostly cash because you're most likely living paycheck to paycheck. Also, your debts are likely higher in interest rates comparatively. This is why the wealth gap is worse than ever before. According to data from the Federal Reserve of the United States, as of the end of calendar year 2021, the top 1% of households in the United States held 32.3% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% of households held just 2.6% of the country's wealth. This wealth inequality has no hope of getting better without changing our fiat monetary system as a whole, because the people who are in charge of our economy are most likely all part of that 1% of the wealthiest. So this system of using inflation to take away wealth from the poorest in society to align the pockets of the rich cannot change because it is the rich who are making the decisions, and you cannot expect humans to act against their own self-interest. So, let me ask you this question again, dear viewer. Do you think that inflation is good or inflation is bad? Do you think deflation is good or do you think deflation is bad? What if we had a deflationary currency that is not controlled by humans, but by an auditable set of rules where the computer code decides the rules of the game, which the computer code cannot be manipulated by those in power, and it's designed from the ground up to reward people who work hard and save value instead of spending money frivolously? Can you think of such a monetary system that fits all those criteria? I'll leave you with that thought. Next week, we'll expand further on moral reasons why Bitcoin should succeed and why Bitcoin promotes peace instead of war. Alright, I think this is a great time to end the show this week. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.